Dr. Matthew Spangler, a professor at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, presenting for us. Dr. Spangler grew up on a diversified crop and livestock farm in Kansas. He received his bachelor's from Kansas State University in 2001, his master's from Iowa State University in 2003, and his doctorate from the University of Georgia in 2006. He is currently a professor of animal genetics and extension beef genetics specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His research work focuses on quantitative genetics and genomics in livestock. And as part of this effort, he works closely with livestock industries, particularly beef industries, to implement improved genetic selection tools and methods. Today, he will be presenting his work entitled Improving the Accuracy of Predictions and the Decisions Made with Them in Beef Cattle. So I will turn the mic over to you, Dr. Spangler. Feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, and apologies for the slow start. You would think multiple years post-COVID, I'd be an expert at doing webinars, but obviously I need a little bit more practice. So the title is relatively naive. I don't know how the audience is, but when I'm asked to provide titles, I try to give something that gives me a lot of room to talk about whatever strikes me at the moment. So that's kind of what this title is, but I'll try to spin a yarn to tell you how we're trying to solve what I think are some relatively complex issues, and I'll shift gears along the way as we go between topics. So kind of at a high level, here's how I view the problem specific to beef cattle and specific to probably North America, although there are other places that would have similar issues. So on the left, there's kind of a relatively simple but standard breeding pyramid. So at the very top, you have nucleus, somewhere in the middle, multipliers, and then of course it broadens out as you get to the base and think about commercial populations. The issue is, and again, focusing on beef cattle, nucleus and multiplier are really together. There are nucleus breeders, but they're all kind of lumped together in what we call seed stock. And that's where data collection occurs. That's where the density of data occurs to inform our genetic evaluations. But if you look at the right-hand side, the problem is that we certainly have evidence, and at least very strong evidence from other species, that the things that we collect in the nucleus and multiplier have a genetic correlation of less than unity with the thing that we really wish to change in the commercial sector, right? So that's a problem. Compounding that problem is that if you look at the traditional breeding pyramid I have on the left, genetic predictions flow down that pyramid, but data do not flow back up, right? So the things we really want to change that are observed in commercial herds, those data are not making their way back up to genetic evaluations to inform prediction. So it could be things like fertility, growth, carcass, health traits. And the reason why the data don't flow up are due to cost, perhaps logistics. The reality is tradition and just the way the beef cattle industry is structured. So what do we do about that other than simply complain? Some friends of mine and I wrote, I don't know if it'd be considered a review paper or an opinion paper, probably a bit of both, that'll probably come out later this year or next year. And in that paper, focused on the benefits of including commercial data in routine genetic evaluation. A savvy anonymous reviewer said you really need to put together a SWOT analysis, and so we did. And if you think about the strengths, it's that goal traits are really expressed in commercial populations. I mean, that's the overarching strength of such a scheme. A weakness is if you think about garnering commercial level data, not all metadata that we might like accompanies that, right? So the whole notion of contemporary grouping, all the systematic effects may be less complete than what we might like. An opportunity is accelerated genetic gain for the traits that we're really interested in, the things that are truly economically relevant. And a threat is, amongst others, this dependency on routine collection of those commercial level data. And what is the benefit for all parties involved? So what do commercial people get out of actually submitting data to a routine genetic evaluation? So if I were forced to put together an overall thesis, I would say that improvements in accuracy would come about through the following things: the modeling of the true traits of interest, the things that we really want to improve, and those are the things observed at the commercial level. Improved modeling of those things such that we attempt to condition out residual variation. And I'll get at that as we go through this. Give proper weight to better data. That's something that I'm not really going to focus on in this talk, but the point is that not all data are created equally. And then to enable more accurate decisions by the end users, because providing them tools that actually help them in their day-to-day decision making encourages participation in the genetic evaluation process. So everyone in the room, audience, is very familiar with this, the breeder's equation or the key equation. But what I want to point out is this whole R bit here, the accuracy. And I would encourage us to think about accuracy as the accuracy of the traits that we really want to improve, pardon me. Again, the things at the commercial level. So seed stock data, if we again think about the beef cattle industry, is relatively small because there's a whole lot more data that exists than what is included in routine genetic evaluations. Now, admittedly, it can be dirty. The systematic effects may be unknown or partially unknown. The trait definitions may differ from what we're accustomed to, but the reality is there's a lot of it. And commercial entities collect data on a daily basis on a whole lot of animals because those data help them inform management decisions and help inform commerce, right? What's an animal worth? The question becomes, how do we capture it? Because the pedigree is latent. Genetic kinship exists, it's just simply not observed. And so one way around that is the genotyping, perhaps in a strategic manner, of commercial animals. So what do people like me do when we don't have the data we want to investigate a problem? We make the data up. The fancy way to say that is we simulate it. All right. So I'm going to, even though I talk about beef cattle, I'm going to start off with a swine simulation that a former graduate student of mine, Garrett C., did. And so he simulated these three purebreds, breed A, B, and C. We form an F1, the AB, so you can think about that as a maternal line female, and we breed it to a terminal boar, that's breed C, right? So this kind of gives you a schematic of what that simulated swine population looked like. And we began to ask the question of how impactful would it be if we included those crossbred, the CAB animals, crossbred phenotypes and genotypes into the genetic prediction of the nucleus animals. So this is extremely colorful, and I didn't do it, Garrett did it. The left-hand side of this, what you'll see is CB, that stands for crossbred, and pedigree. That means that we're using a pedigree-based evaluation. The right side then, CB gen, means we're using genomic information to inform the kinship among animals. The vertical axis is the crossbred phenotype. So in this case, we want to increase that. That would be an improvement. On the horizontal axis is the genetic correlation we assumed between the crossbred and purebred phenotypes, ranging from 0.1 to 0.9. The different color bars denote the proportion of crossbred animals we included into the genetic evaluation. And as we included crossbred animals in the genetic evaluation, we proportionally reduced the number of nucleus animals or purebred animals that we included. So we include crossbreds, we take out some nucleus information. So that's what I mean here by removing phenotypes of purebred animals or removing both genotypes and phenotypes of purebred animals. The take home from this colorful graphic is, and I don't think it should be a surprise, when the genetic correlation between the purebred and crossbred trait is the lowest, that's when it is the most impactful to actually include crossbred information into the genetic evaluation. The other take home is that we don't have to include a lot of it. Including only 10% of the data being crossbred into the genetic prediction has a very large impact. Now, when the genetic correlation between the two, the purebred and crossbred trait is very high, 0.9, so they're approaching being the exact same trait, then we actually see an erosion in our ability to make progress as we replace nucleus phenotypes and genotypes with crossbred phenotypes and genotypes. Okay. Same project, but here we ask the question, well, if we need to include crossbred information into genetic evaluation, how do we choose which crossbreds to do it on? So now the different colored bars are related to how we chose those crossbred individuals. Did we choose them at random? Do we choose only the best full sibs, the best half sibs, the worst full sibs, the worst half sibs? Or did we choose amongst either full or half sibs being based on extremeness? So both the best and the worst within full sib or half sib families? Or do we choose things in the middle of a full sib family or in the middle of a half sib family? And so what we learned, again, which I don't think is that surprising, is that if we have to choosing from both tails of the distribution, so the extreme, kind of denoted by these blue bars, is more advantageous. So we're learning from both tails of the distribution. So the take home is that we can get a small fraction of crossbred data and make a big difference, particularly when the genetic correlation between crossbred and purebred traits is low. The way we select them matters. But that's for genetic prediction. If we're also estimating variance components at the same time, then some degree of randomness in that selection is actually beneficial. Otherwise, we run the risk of biasing the variance component estimates. I think the next question then is, do we really need to genotype the individual animals themselves, or is there a cheaper way to do it? And that cheaper way very well could be pooling. So this notion isn't new, and I have some references here to literature, so dates back close to 10 years ago now, going back to the Reverter paper in 2016. But we felt at the time that a gap existed for the use of pooled data in kind of routine genetic evaluations in that framework. So again, we conducted a simulation looking at the use of pooled data, trying to answer the questions of, well, how best do we do this? How many animals should be in a pool? And recognizing the fact that at least in beef cattle, there may be some generational gaps in having parents or seed stock animals actually genotype. So we conducted a simulation that had 15 generations. The 15th generation we assumed were the commercial animals, and those were the animals that were subjected to pooling. So we constructed different pool sizes. So one animal, that's not much of a pool, but for completeness sake, said we'll have individual animals and then pool sizes of 2, 10, 20, 50, and 100. And then the other extreme case was just assume that we have no information on the crossbred progeny or the commercial progeny themselves. So that gives us kind of the worst case scenario. The way in which we chose animals for pooling was randomly allocated them to pools, or strategically tried to minimize phenotypic variation within a pool That means we maximize differences as we go across pools. Or to try to make it look really bad, we uniformly maximized phenotypic variation within a pool. So the phenotype for a pool is the average phenotype of individuals contributing to that pool. So think about a carcass trait in beef cattle, maybe a marbling score. The phenotype of a pool then is the average marbling score of the individuals that comprise that pool. And the reason why this is particularly germane is if you think about commercial animal phenotypes, think of something like feed intake. We don't get individual animal feed intake. We get feed intake for a group of animals, a pen of animals. So this is another way of thinking about leveraging group phenotypes because that's the way they occur in industry. Genotypes, for the purposes of our simulation, were actually the average of the simulated genotypes for the individuals that comprise the pool. So the analysis, we actually used a single-step G-BLUP model. So this is H, the hybrid kinship matrix. But for the pooled observations, all these stars means we had to augment things. And so for the H kinship matrix, when we included pooled observations, you can think about the genomic relationship matrix being comprised of elements that are individual to individual kinship, group to group kinship, and then kinship between individuals and groups. And so the diagonal elements, or at least we assumed the diagonal elements of G, the genomic relationship matrix, when we considered groups, was proportional to 1 over the number of animals in the group. Because we're dealing with group phenotypes, we weighted the residuals proportional to the number of observations that was contained in that group or pooled phenotype. And for simulation, we considered the accuracy of our predictions to be the Pearson correlation between the true and predicted breeding values. So what this plot shows you is estimated breeding value accuracy for the sires that were born in generation 14. So they're the sires of the commercial animals that were then born in generation 15. I know it may be hard to see, but along the horizontal axis, I have the generation at which genotyping stopped, right? So if we go to generation 14 on the horizontal axis, that means the sires of the commercial offspring were themselves genotyped. And we can look at the changes in those sires' EBV accuracy when we had no information coming from generation 15, all the way up to if we had individual commercial level data coming in. That would be a pool size of 1. What I really want to drive home here is that if we minimize or create pools based on minimizing phenotypic variation within the pool, that we can actually increase EBV accuracy even when we're utilizing pool sizes of 20 or 50 animals. That means we're taking group phenotypes and pooled genotypes for groups of up to 20 or 50 animals, and we're improving EBV accuracy. And the fact is if we compare it to having individual animal accuracy, we really don't reduce, or individual animal phenotypes, we really don't reduce the accuracy of the prediction of the sires by much when we consider groups of 10 or 20. So at least from simulation, if we construct pools in this manner, it appears as though this may be a cheaper way of being able to garner commercial level phenotypes. So I've talked about, if we think about this kind of fundamental equation of P equals G plus E, which I've changed a little bit here, we've talked about how we might get phenotypes on commercial animals, and that's through either strategically, individually genotyping them, or perhaps leveraging pooled genotyping. But what I want to talk about now is once we maybe have that, how do we do a better job of modeling the G and perhaps a better job of modeling the capital E? This lowercase e here is meant to be the residual, right? So I ask those questions. Can we do a better job of modeling G, and can we describe E better such that we actually reduce or condition out some of the residual variation? Because modeling G better and conditioning out residual variation both have an impact on the ratio of variances we use in the mixed model equations. So one way we thought about trying to model G better is making maybe use of variance that we would not traditionally leverage by using commercially available assays. And so we started a project to investigate the use of low-pass whole genome sequencing. Why low-pass? Because it's cheaper. That's one of the benefits. Obviously, it has to be informed by imputation. So we started with a list of about 1.1 million variants that were categorized based on their predicted functional impact as either low, moderate, or high, or then classification based on mutation. And in that case, we put them into 6 different buckets. This project used about 2,300 crossbred animals from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center's Germplasm Evaluation Project. So we started out investigating the impact of these selected variants from whole genome sequence in traits that we have a lot more information on in beef cattle, and that's growth traits. And I'm just going to show examples today for birth weight. That's what BWT is. This GRM is the genomic relationship matrix. So we formed GRMs based on a commercially available assay, which had about 80,000 variants. Full, which would be all of the imputed variants from low-pass sequence, or then the different categories that I shared with you on the previous slide, and estimated variance components, and then genetic parameters, which I have represented as heritability over here. High, right, the things that are predicted to have a large impact, only explained about 10% of the adjusted phenotypic variance for this trait. Now, of note is that high category only had about 7,000 variants when you compare that to the low category, which had considerably more variance. We did go through and look at random subsets of low and tried to match not only the number of variants contained in high, but also their distribution across the genome and also their minor allele frequency. And when we did that, albeit slight, the heritability of those low subsets still outperformed that of the high subset. That's a bit disappointing. The other thing we did is fit models that had multiple GRM. So an example, models that may have a GRM comprised of low, plus one with modifier, plus one with moderate, and then plus another GRM with high. So we're actually estimating multiple random effects at the same time, which is actually equivalent to a Bayes RC kind of model, right? We're bucketing different subsets of variance based on our prior belief of some kind of biological impact. And when we do that, we see that the amount of variation explained by high in general starts to trend towards 0, right? So even though we prune these based on LD, so between high and any other subsets, if there was a variant in high that had LD of 0.7 or greater, we took it out of the other subset, we still see some kind of covariance amongst these. This just shows the other bucketing of those variants based on the consequence of the mutation. where groupings 5 and 6 would have more substantial consequence of mutation. And we see kind of the same thing as we did with the high category before, okay, relatively lower proportions of variation explained. And when those GRMs are fit with other groupings, the amount of variation they explain tends to head towards 0. That said, we've continued on using low-pass whole genome sequence because it does allow us more flexibility in the variants we fit, and now starting to use that in conjunction with metagenomic sequencing to do a better job of trying to condition out residual variation and do a better job of predicting the phenotype. So this is the data structure of a set of animals that we have imputed low pass on, as well as metagenomic sequencing. I'm hesitant to call this a design because I didn't do it. I was just handed the data. But what you have are a set of steers that were fed a certain diet type and a certain set of heifers fed a different diet type. Within steers and heifers, there are also different levels of concentrate or different qualities of forage. You go all the way down to the bottom tier here, you see animals born across different years and different seasons. And so I don't really want to go into a lot of detail in this other than to point out that these data I'm going to show you aren't necessarily clean, right? There's about 750 animals, but they are split across a multitude of different groupings, which include vastly different diet types. So if you think about metagenomic studies, particularly studies focused on prediction, this gets a little bit dirty. So these were submitted to shotgun metagenomic sequencing. The features we used are actually ORFs, or open reading frames. And what we did was added one to each read count, calculated the relative abundance, applied some filters, and then did a log base 10 transformation of the relative abundance. And so the goal was to try to predict using both imputed low-pass sequence, so genomic information on the host, as well as metagenomic data, predict different phenotypes in beef cattle, being average daily gain and average daily dry matter intake. Here's the information on how we formed the GRM. That was about 750,000 imputed sequence variants. But then for the metagenomic, I'd call it relationship matrix here, I'd feel more comfortable calling it just a covariance matrix. We use different variations. So we formed that following a similar method as the way we formed the GRM, but then we also formed it the way that Ross and others did in their 2013 paper. And the big difference between those is applying a scaling factor to the ORF based on the sum of all the variances, or scaling each ORF separately by its own variance. Okay, that's the big difference between those two metagenomic covariance matrix construction methods. And then we further altered the way we formed that metagenomics covariance matrix, one that I call naive. It means we kind of wave our hands at the fact that these animals were fed different diets. One where we weighted each ORF as a function of the heritability of that ORF, the heritability that we estimated from these data. So we're trying to give more weight to the ORF that are less heritable, because we're also fitting a genomic relationship matrix. And then what we called a data-driven approach, where we actually split up the metagenomic covariance matrix and said, right, we recognize some of these animals were fed concentrate, some were fed forage, and so we're going to scale those components differently. So it'd be akin to a multi-population genomic relationship matrix. In addition to fitting just host genomics and metagenomic covariance matrices, we also fit the Hadamard product of those two to look at the potential interaction. Just to point out, a little over 11% of the ORF that we used in this project had a heritability of greater than 0.2, so a very large density that were lowly heritable. And this is the genetic parameters, or the parameters, I guess I should say, that we estimated. So this is for average daily dry matter intake. And this was with the naive microbial covariance matrix. You can see the heritability, so that's coming from the imputed low-pass sequence data. You can see the proportion explained by the metagenomic covariance matrix. In the literature, that's called the microbiability, which I really have disdain for that, because I don't know why you would just add ability onto the end of any word and think you created a new one. So I prefer just to call it the proportion explained, and happy if anyone wants to be offended and disagree with me. Then this is the proportion of variance explained by the interaction, and then the total across all three of these terms. Heritability is relatively the same no matter what we do to the metagenomic covariance matrix. Overall, the interaction, at least in these data, was relatively small in proportionality, but we explained quite a bit of the adjusted phenotypic variance when we sum all of these things together, suggesting we could do a much better job at phenotypic prediction using these kinds of more complex combined models. Interestingly, I have here one man's trash, and that's meant to be one man's trash is another man's treasure. And working with a very talented colleague of mine who's a microbiologist, rumen ecologist, whatever you want to call him, through a different project, he was talking about all the filtering they did to get rid of sequence reads that were not what they were targeting, right? They were targeting the metagenome, and they got a lot of contamination. And so I asked, well, what is that contamination? Well, it's bovine sequence reads. Well, my goodness, I hate to throw away bovine sequence reads if we could make use of it. So we took the stuff that they were filtering out and threw away and asked the question, can we impute that up to whole genome sequence? And from one sample that was destined for metagenomic sequencing to inform whether it be OTU or ASV or ORF level kind of data, could we actually get host genomic information too? And what we have here is the read depth, what we're able to recover from bovine sequence read depth from those samples, and concordance of imputed whole genome sequence to array genotypes. We had these animals genotyped with arrays too. And on the left-hand side, we didn't filter any of the imputed variant calls. And on the right-hand side, we did filter them to a confidence level of 75%. What I want you to understand here is if the read depth was about 0.15, we have pretty accurate imputed calls. There's one exception here, this animal floating out here at a read depth of about 2.2, where we didn't do as well. And looking at that animal, they had extremely heterozygous array genotype calls, which made that animal a bit strange to begin with. And that's why I rationalize that we didn't do as good a job of matching imputed calls to the array calls for that animal. But I think, and it's not as if we're the only people to think this way, right? But it's exciting to think you take one sample on an animal and can use it for multiple purposes and have host genomic information directly tied to the phenotype, which is the metagenomic sequence. All right, this is the last time I'm going to shift gears on you, and it's a fairly dramatic shift. And depending on what you like the most, it's either a downshift or I've gone into a higher gear. But it gets to my earlier point that somehow we need to convince the end user that this whole thing centered around genetic evaluation is actually germane to them, such that they want to engage in the process more deeply, i.e., actually contribute data to that. And so one way I've envisioned that is allowing some customization in the decisions they take with the results of routine genetic evaluations, i.e., the expected progeny differences or the estimated breeding values. And so this is software we developed, which we call iGenDeck, which allows web-based kind of customized economic selection index development. It's available through the Beef Improvement Federation, so you can go to beefimprovement.org, sign up for an evaluation account, and play with it if you'd like. It has beef on beef and beef on dairy production systems involved in it. And what this system does is allows, as I said, a platform to construct economic selection indexes based on the user's own breeding objective, their breeding system, so what breeds they use, are they crossbreeding, their planning horizon, so what's the time out into the future that they wish to contemplate the economic costs and returns associated with a selection decision, economic parameters that are theirs, and then the current performance of their herd. So it takes this information and behind the scenes uses stochastic simulation to build a relatively large beef cattle herd that generates phenotypes for the length of the user's specified planning horizon. So it takes genetic and residual variances and covariances from the literature and uses Cholesky decomposition to create those phenotypes. So that's kind of reiterated here on this slide. It's all written in Go. And we actually checked in the code into GitHub. So if anyone wants to go through installing it themselves, they're welcome to, or you can just go to the implemented version through BIF. But after the end of the specified planning horizon, it's just simple accounting based on the simulated phenotypes and the economic parameters that the user submitted to the system. And we calculate the marginal economic values, which are then the index weights that can be applied to selection candidates. And what I want to show you here, and the reason why this level of customization may actually be advantageous, is that I compared indexes in this example, or actually a former graduate student of mine did, whether animals were sold at a weaning endpoint, that's the W, or a carcass endpoint, that's a C, at different lengths of planning horizon, so from 2 all the way out to 50. And what you can see is choice of endpoint or breeding objective, weaning or carcass matters. So this area I have circled shows that the rank correlation between those two endpoints averaged across length of planning horizon is only 0.7, meaning there would be considerable re-ranking among selection candidates. And even within an endpoint of the animal, weaning or carcass, if you look across planning horizon, there's sensitivity there as well, right? So if I choose a very short-term planning horizon, I'm emphasizing traits observed early in life as compared to a longer-term planning horizon, which emphasizes things that may be observed later in life because there's discounted expression levels. So this also shows the impact of things like planning horizon. So planning horizon 2, 10, and 20 across the horizontal axis. The relative emphasis of these three traits, mature cow weight, stayability, and hot carcass weight, and kind of a life cycle index. And as planning horizon increases, the emphasis or the relative emphasis in the breeding goal for traits like mature cow weight and stayability increase, whilst that of hot carcass weight, a revenue driver, begins to decrease. So this kind of maybe nuance or fine tuning can very much impact a producer's decisions And as a consequence, I believe their overall success in utilizing the genetic predictions that we provide them. This just shows how decisions or relative emphasis in a breeding goal may change. If I change on the horizontal axis, the cost associated with maintaining mature cows, so $250 per AUM to $500 to $750 a year. And as cost goes up, but the value of offspring stays the same, then all of a sudden the relative emphasis I need to put on actually decreasing mature cow weight goes up substantially. So again, these kinds of decisions can be unique to the individual enterprise. And I think this level of customization for producers with the wherewithal to parameterize it can lead them to more successful decisions and ultimately more belief in the products that come out of genetic evaluation. I'm going to skip over that one in the sake of time, but just to say that access of this software again can be you can get access to it through the Beef Improvement Federation. BIF doesn't charge anything for use in extension or teaching purposes. But if somebody wants to use it to create indexes to market animals or for a breed association, things like that, there is a fee that organization charges. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to visit with you, even though it's remotely. And to any graduate students still sitting in the room and not checking their phones, I'd say that welcome inquiries for anyone that would like to spend some time at UNL with me or any of the other colleagues. We've got 5 of us here in breeding and genetics because we do have graduate student and postdoc opportunities available. And if anyone's particularly interested in prediction using metagenomic and genomic data coupled, or prediction using industry data related to pooling, please reach out to me. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that the group may have.
Thank you so much, Matt. Great presentation. It was very interesting. And now I will open the floor to questions. So if we have any questions in the room or online, you're welcome to turn on your microphone or type into the chat if you're online. Have anything in the room? We have one in the room. I'm gonna hand the mic over.
Hi, I was just wondering, I'm not familiar with the beef industry, but is there a group that works with producers that's currently that's prioritizing genetic evaluations?
So the short answer is yes. The way it's structured, at least in North America, is that seed stock producers submit their data to what we call breed associations. So an example, Simmental has an association and Charlet has an association, et cetera, et cetera. And those organizations are really in charge of the genetic evaluation. That said, those organizations often partner. So there's a large one called International Genetic Solutions, which conducts the genetic evaluation for multiple of those associations together. Others, like Hereford or Angus, conduct their own. So that's how the genetic evaluation is actually done. In terms of who provides then some guidance as to how that best be done, that's academic institutions that maybe partner with those breed associations to do research and development. And then there are also some guidelines set forth by that Beef Improvement Federation entity that I mentioned that actually have a wiki of best practices relative to data collection, recording, and modeling. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it did. That was perfect. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat here from Kristen Lee. She asks, what are the pros and cons of DNA pooling versus low density genotyping of individuals plus imputation?
Yeah, pros and cons. So if you think about maybe low density arrays with imputation, the low density arrays still have a cost. So it's a question of just how cheap can the low density array get? And is the cost cheap enough that it makes sense to do on commercial level animals? And then how accurate is the imputation? Realizing that those commercial animals, we'd at least hope, are crossbred. Those are the downsides. The benefit is you get individual level data. Pooling, a major downside is the ability to do that at commercial scale, because if you just send a group of samples to some place like Neogen and say, now I want you to take these physical samples and form DNA pools, my suspicion is that any cost savings you think you were going to get are going to quickly go away, because they're going to say there's a whole lot of labor involved in that, right? So that's the huge downside of pooling. And then the other is, of course, that you don't get individual level data. So I'm not, well, you didn't ask me to vote on one. You asked for pros and cons, but to me, there's give and take in terms of what the return on investment is between those two strategies. A hope I have is that low pass sequencing, maybe at depths of even less than half X, may become cheap enough where all of a sudden then we can look at that more seriously for use on commercial animals. The other bit I would say is that I think the return on investment of doing commercial animals, however we do them, becomes better if we can return a prediction to the commercial producer that actually informs management level decisions. And that prediction has to be more than genetic merit. It has to be a phenotypic based prediction to inform management and commerce.
Thank you. I have a quick question. Is there a variation in the value that we see with pooling depending on the trait that you're looking at?
That's a good question. I guess my short answer is the metric we want to use is the proportional gain in accuracy, so not the absolute value of accuracy, because it's tempting to say that it's also a function of the heritability. Yeah, if we're talking about pooling commercial animals, it really gets down to what's the value of the commercial phenotype to begin with. And that really becomes a function of the genetic correlation between the commercial trait and the nucleus trait. And so as that genetic correlation gets lower, the value in getting the commercial level phenotype is greater, no matter how we get it.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of a follow-up question. You had mentioned at the end beef on dairy, and I was wondering if some of these techniques would be valuable in beef on dairy. I know there's been some difficulty in connecting those pedigrees when we're trying to look at some of those traits for that new aspect of the industry.
Yeah, so beef on dairy actually, in some cases, is a windfall of commercial data, particularly commercial carcass data, to inform beef cattle genetic evaluations. But there's probably not a lot of people keen, to your point, to spend, even $25 an animal to genotype those. So yeah, I think anything we can do to get genomic information, to not only be confident in the sire side of the pedigree, because we just assume that's known, but that could be a dangerous assumption. But then I think, to your point, to have a better understanding of the maternal grandsire side of the pedigree could be extremely useful. it would be nice to envision a case, as happens in other countries, where we actually have indexes which kind of evaluate dairy animals based on beef producing ability as well. But yeah, the short answer to your question is, yeah, I think it could be helpful so that we don't have half the pedigree that's unknown other than breed.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Mike Loheis. How correlated is the average of the individual dry matter intake phenotypes versus the pen dry matter intake phenotypes?
Correlation between the average of the animals in a pen
versus the individual level phenotype, the average of the individual.
I might be overthinking about this. So the average of the individual correlated to what?
The pen dry matter intake phenotypes.
Oh, right. Well, those are that's a part whole relationship, right? So the pen feed intake, or the average of the pen is just simply the total pen divided by the number of animals in it. So maybe the question is really how much information is lost, and you can get to the same place regardless of which phenotype you use. So I'm not seeing a big loss there. I think that. I'll go ahead.
Yeah, Matt, I was just wondering, how similar the phenotype is, because individual feed intake, is it really the same trait as an animal just eating at a feed bunk?
Yeah, no. So I understand your question now. Thanks. Yeah. So I don't have any data, unfortunately, to answer that question. So I'm going to couch this with, this is my guess. I would guess that the correlation is not one, and could be moderate at best, because I think getting individual intake, be it a Vitelli Sense or a Incitec, versus having animals eat in a group kind of setting, I just don't think that's the same trait. But I'm couching it with, that's my gut.
Yeah, that's my guess as well.
Yeah. But I don't want that to sound as though I'm discounting the value of getting individual feed intake records. I'm not discounting that, but I would just say that it's probably not the exact trait we want to change in commercial animals. And so if we can get the commercial pen level data, all the better.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we have one more question here in the room.
I'm not sure if I missed this, but the website, the Gen Deck that you were talking about, are you able to keep those, like what producers are valuing in the index and use that to see what they're valuing, or is it strictly just for academics, or like what's the goal with that?
Yeah. So no, you didn't miss it. I probably just did a poor job of explaining it. So the goal of it is to really allow a producer to say, based on my situation, right? What feed costs me, or how much I sell calves for, what should my selection index be, right? That's the goal. And this tool is actually now used by a handful of breed associations to redo their economic indexes, actually used by some relatively large cattle producers to develop custom indexes themselves. So does the system actually retain that? So I can go in and, as a system administrator, and mine that data. No, I can't see that. So we set it up with intentionality such that Matt Spangler can't go in and look at your parameters. There are some safety checks in place to make sure you're using it according to the terms of use. And I approve the accounts, but I can't see things that go into your proprietary index. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're coming up. Do we have any last questions? Oh, we have one more in the room. Sorry, setting up a mic here.
Hi. I also have a question about your software. So you said some organizations are using it. Do you know how many individual producers are using it?
Yeah, so last I checked, there's about 40 to 45 active accounts, not including students that are using that at other institutions for class. Of those accounts, about 5 of them are breed associations. So that leaves about 40 that are non-breed association. But some of that is, extension personnel using it for extension programming, kind of producer education things. I can highlight a couple of large commercial, relatively large cattle producers that have a seed stock enterprise, but then feed animals through their own feedlot that are the product of the germplasm that they sold, right? So they're semi-integrated in that fashion. And they're using this tool to develop an index to inform nucleus level selection, understanding what the value of those traits are to their own feedlots. So there are cases where that's occurring.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you again, Mike. Sorry, Matt, for joining us today. It was a really interesting talk and discussion. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. We will have another presentation next week.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.